Yes.
Okay, good evening, guys. Thank you for coming. This is our first Kubernetes K8SUG, or you can say Kubernetes User Group Canada, and it's not new. So worldwide, like it started from Singapore, Australia, and this is the third one we're actually opening up. There are a few people who are from actually Singapore and Australia who is joining us. So today's agenda will start a little later, but just I quickly introduced my organizer like Ashish. He is the core organizer. Core volunteer is Pujan. And we have the speaker John from Cloudcasa and the birds from Radware and Vishwajit from Radware. So I'll hand over to Ashish to just quickly start and let us know about the Kubernetes Canada chapter.
Sure. Thank you. Hey guys, good evening. Sorry for the delay. Thanks for showing up on after office hours. So yeah, so we are starting this Kubernetes user group in Canada. This is our first meetup. You will see some hiccups, like Mike is not there. We were not aware about that. Sorry about that. Hope everyone can hear me. Yes. Okay, cool. So this is typical a link of the group. Event coordinator, I think already Deb introduced everyone. So Yongkan is from Australia. He's our main organizer who built this group initially in Singapore. Then he moved to Australia. We have a presence in Australia as well as Singapore, now in Canada too. Deb, he just introduced himself, myself, and Pujan. So this is typical QR code. We can, like, if you guys want to take a picture or scan it out, you can see the number of presence and number of members, like 2,000 members in Singapore. It's been 1 year last week, 600 plus members in Australia, and now 250 around members in Canada. So why we started the group and why we are here, it's typical relates with the Kubernetes. I hope everyone knows about Kubernetes, or is someone very new to Kubernetes? New? Okay. Anyone else who is very new, who don't know anything about Kubernetes? Really? Good. So basically to promote Kubernetes technologies, maybe share details how people really works in the real-time scenarios. So there are 2 presentations today. We are going to cover more presentations in coming months. The plan is to have every month 1 event. Yeah, so if you guys are aware about it or not, so Kubernetes gives us many functionalities by default. This is more like, I think whoever worked in Kubernetes must be knowing about these features of Kubernetes: scalability, portability, service discovery, load balancing, self-healing, and security. So there are multiple components behind the scenes which runs around it. So CNCF, Cloud Native Foundation, actually puts a very big landscape around it. I'm not really sure who has seen this landscape. It talks about monitoring, security tooling, deployment tooling, everything. So Kubernetes is basically a very wide technology right now. Like personally, I keep learning it. Even I'm an administrator in Kubernetes, but I still learning all the things in cloud native stuff. So yeah, some of our sponsors from behind, from Singapore also, like JFrog, Cloudcasa, RBC today for allowing us to be in the venue. So yeah, as I just told, this is our first meetup. So we want to grow, share with other people. There are the links to, if you want to be a speaker on the meetup, you want to be a sponsor, you want to be a volunteer. You can see easily, we will reach, I know some people already registered, we have not reached them yet because we were just planning this first meetup to go well. But soon you will see some messages from us, either me or Deb. We're gonna reach to you guys, talk to you guys, how we can improve it, how we can build this community better in Canada. So there are some meetups event we are targeting. Right now, there is some, okay, these events are mostly coordinated by Kubernetes group in Australia or Singapore. So these are the dates. There is usually, you can always find it on meetups. And there are usually what you call, there is a Zoom link if you guys want to join in, but I know it's like 9 of us and they are presenting in Australia or Singapore.
But the recording versions is
recording version will be available on YouTube after a while. Like we do some modifications to that. We are planning to have our next event. I think the date is a bit wrong. 24 instead of 24, 25th, right?
Yeah, 25th.
So 25th September.
6 to 7:30 p.m.
Yeah. So
same
place. Same place.
Yeah.
Hope we can do better best. We also have a LinkedIn page. If you guys want to follow it, it's under the most active Kubernetes meetup. There is a QR code you can scan, or if you guys follow us, we are a part of that, so you can see that also. So that was the introduction. I hope everyone likes it. So topic 1, safeguarding Kubernetes API from both by Velero, and then topic 2, managing Velero backups.
Yeah. So before we start with the topic, just let you know that once this topic's over, then we can take the questions and answers. If you want to know about or interested about the volunteers or what we are planning for the roadmap or anything, just it's welcome. You can ask us. We can try to provide the answers as soon as possible or before 7:30 p.m. Food will be available outside, and I will let you know once it's available. So you can have it most probably by 6:30. It will be ready, and I can allow Virg, you can start your presentation, and or trigger John, you can.
You need the cable, right?
Yeah.
Is that the?
That's it.
I don't even know what the adapter is.
Yeah, it's coming.
So everybody knows about blue screen of death?
Yeah.
I just got it. Whose laptop were we presenting in? Was it yours? Can we use your laptop? I have the presentation on a USB stick.
I don't have a USB cable. I have.
What you have?
You can try the user experience.
Well, we can start with John, and then by the time it's ready, what do you say?
It just crashed. Blue screen of death. You never heard of Windows blue screen of death?
I know.
So
Can you use the new
I
have seen it, but I don't use Windows, so it's not.
But he needs to be in Zoom link, right?
He has on the chat, right?
Really?
Let me just message you.
Okay.
Sure. I think that this will be done.
Yeah, probably. That's why this is. It will take time. Maybe you can allow John.
yeah, John.
I think John, you can start, and by the time it will be ready, and because it will take time for you.
Yeah,
I have to give you access, and then and take a little reboot and.
Yeah, it's good.
Okay. Yeah, it's okay. So take your time. That's fine.
And show on Zoom too.
Okay, sure. We're always right. Yeah. Okay, meanwhile they are preparing, let me take up two pictures as well, so that these are there on social handle. So these are business continuity plan. We're moving to the plan B. So John is. All right, okay.
One more.
Over to you, John.
Thank you very much.
All right, hi everyone. My name is John. I'm a platform and DevOps engineer for Cloudcasa, and we've been building a solution that works on top of Velero to manage your existing open source backups. So anyone who's not familiar with Velero, I'll walk you through it. You're probably lucky enough to have never had to recover a cluster in Kubernetes if you're not familiar with Velero. It is the #1 open source tool used for disaster recovery of Kubernetes resources. So the way it works is you have your regular Kubernetes cluster. You just install a Velero server deployment into your cluster. And then from there, you set up a backup storage location. And you can run a Velero backup or create a Velero schedule. So you can do an ad hoc backup just to do a one-off and back up your data, or set up some kind of weekly, daily schedule to back up your data. So that'll actually snapshot all the resources and the persistent volumes that you have in your cluster. So any changes that you make, you can go back to an earlier recovery point. And those all get shipped off to your backup storage location. So that could be an S3 bucket over any S3 protocol. And once you install Velero, it has like a command line API similar to kubectl, right? So this is the interface for Velero. It's all on the command line. So if you want to create a backup, you have to do Velero backup create, etc., right? So there's no UI, everything is done through here, and all the extra configuration options that you might want are also just done through command line or through files that you pass through. So this leads to a lot of headaches in a lot of environments. If you have a small cluster and you're just backing up one little development cluster or one production cluster, it's pretty straightforward, right? But then once you start to scale up and you have multiple clusters, or let's say you want to migrate your clusters, there's a lot of room for error when you're just typing in command line options. So Velero pain points. There's a lot of them because it's an open source tool and there's not really a lot of established best practices ready for it yet. So first of all, Velero, when you recover something into Velero, you need a cluster to put it in, right? So you take a snapshot of your existing cluster and then you lose the cluster. Let's say the infrastructure is completely gone. Something happens in your vCenter and your on-premises cluster is destroyed and you have no more node machines. The only way to restore the data, even if you have that Velero backup, is to actually have a cluster to put it on. So this can be annoying if you're in an environment where it's not so easy to spin something up or you don't have your Terraform files ready to go. You don't have a cluster ready, then you can't really make use of the backups that you have. And we see, we try to remain active in the Velero users Slack. So we see a lot of complaints from users or a lot of questions from users using Velero that don't have time or the capability or the people around to actually be able to build up a new cluster for them. So that's the first pain point we've identified. Multi-region restore. So this is another problem a lot of Velero users have, especially in environments where your volumes might be locked by region, right? So you create a backup or you create a volume in US East 1 on AWS, and you realize that Velero is only capable of backing up or restoring in that same region with those restores, right? So in the case where you want to restore a cluster to a new region or you even want to migrate it, you're kind of stuck. There are manual ways to get around this, but again, it's a lot of trying and failing, and it's hard to find the logs a lot of times to see exactly what's going wrong. And then anytime you have to use some kind of workaround, there's always more room to fail. So multi-region support in Velero leaves something to be desired. There's no centralized location. So if you have a bunch of air-gapped or siloed clusters, and you want to manage them with Velero, you have to go into each cluster one at a time, switch your kubectl context, and actually go into the cluster and make your changes, create a backup. There's no way to have a fleet of clusters easily ready just with one command or one click of a button to back them all up with Velero. Migration is difficult. So like I was saying before, if you're stuck in one region or even if you're stuck in one cloud provider, there might not be a way to get it out if you just have a regular Velero backup, right? Let's say you're in AWS and your costs are going too high. You want to switch over to GCP or Azure. Well, you'll probably have to rebuild your whole cluster, and then you won't really be able to easily restore your resources. And a large cluster environment. So I touched on this before, but if you have a whole fleet of clusters that you need to go into one at a time and actually manage, they're going to be inconsistent between. Let's say you forget to go into one cluster and create a backup, or let's say one of the schedules is slightly off and you want to tweak it. You have to do this for every cluster individually. So this is a pain for an administrator who probably uses multiple clusters. I know working with Cloudcasa as part of the platform engineering team, I manage 4 or 5 clusters every day that I have to do regular backups, and we have to tweak schedules, tweak configuration for all of these. And if I had to go in and do it one at a time with Velero, it would be very time consuming. that could be a whole other position of just somebody who does Velero management, right? And of course, there's so many issues, and troubleshooting issues with Velero is difficult. It's pretty new technology, like most Kubernetes providers are. And there's just not much documented. There's not many people to go to. So like I said, we're very active in the Velero user Slack channel. But it's having to rely on other people to answer things when the answer is pretty open-ended or people might not know the best practices. It's tough, especially if you want a quick answer and it's something that should be relatively straightforward, right? So people have issues just trying to restore their data, and then you get some nonsense error from your Velero pods log. You have to go digging around to even find the log in the first place, and then you Google the error, you ask ChatGPT, and there's nothing. So then what do? You're stuck. You have no one to go to besides the Slack channel, right? So it would be nice to have some kind of platform that was centralized that you could put all of your data into, and has a live support that you could contact 24/7. So this is where Cloudcasa comes in, right? So we use Velero, we use Kubernetes, obviously, all of our backend is on Kubernetes. And all of these pain points are the same for us, right? We're learning just like everyone else is. So the first thing we decided to do was we need multi-cluster management. Okay, so we ignore any kind of provider that you're using. It doesn't matter if you're on any cloud provider, bare metal, vSphere, or anything. We'll actually bring up, you can easily add all of your clusters, especially if they already have Velero installed. This is from, there we go. So consider a case where you have a bunch of clusters. They may or may not have Velero installed already, right? So in some environments, you might not be doing regular scheduled backups or anything. And then your clusters are just completely unprotected. If they get blown up, you'll probably have to rebuild them. A lot of people use Terraform or Kustomize or some kind of infrastructure as a code, but you won't get any persistent volume data back either if you do that, if you just recover. So a lot of people in this case would go one by one, install Velero in each of your clusters or add it to your manifests in Terraform or something. And then you still have to go in and manage your backup storage locations, right? Especially if you have to recover things. You'll have to go in one at a time. So instead, you can actually just import all of these clusters to Cloudcasa. So if we find an existing Velero instance on your cluster, we'll automatically import all of your existing backups and schedules into Cloudcasa. And you get one centralized hub for all of your clusters. So you can go over in here. This screen is just a basic overview. This is your dashboard page. So it just shows you all of your recent jobs, the status of all your clusters, your data usage and everything, all from one page. If you don't have Velero installed on your clusters already, you can skip that step too. You can just go straight to Cloudcasa and then just have one service running. So as long as you just open up one port so that our server can talk to the agent that we install on your cluster, you're free to go from there. You never have to touch it again. Once the agent's running, it's installed, it'll automatically update. You don't have to do anything. All you have to do is go to the UI, and from here, configuration is easy. Real-time job monitoring. So in Velero, if anyone's used it, I'm sure you've noticed, you do Velero create job, you hit enter, and then it disappears. It says you can check here for logs, or you can describe the backup, right? But there's no way to follow along with your logs to actually find out what's going on under the hood. And then after the job, if you see it's failed or partially failed or some other message, it doesn't even easily display why it failed. Sometimes you have to scroll through pages of logs just to get the one error message that's hidden in there. So with our real-time job monitoring, as soon as you start a job, you'll see the status of it pop up. You can follow the activity log as it goes. You can see where the logs are coming from exactly. So you see if it's a provider issue, if it's something with your cloud provider giving you an error, it'll say that. If it's something with Velero, it'll say that, or some misconfiguration, it'll tell you. You can see all of your jobs in one page, including their statuses. So if you have a schedule that runs a huge fleet backup on 20 clusters that happens at 12 o'clock every day, you can click on your dashboard every day at 12 and watch and make sure they go. And if they fail, you can set up an alert. You don't have to check it. Configuration management. If you use Velero, when you set up a backup, all of the different options you pass through are through the command line. So you can set up some kind of YAML file with configuration, some kind of template to use, but still, if you want to select specific namespaces, resources, or any other labels or anything, you have to do this all manually for each cluster again. So with Cloudcasa, you could actually create a backup template or just create a backup ad hoc every time you do this, right? So you can select namespaces, the types of resources you want, the labels, any combination of those options. And then whether or not you want to snapshot persistent volumes. So you have different options here. You can snapshot a persistent volume. So that'll retain where the volume belongs in your resource manifest, right? So the volume will still exist the next time you restore it. but the data on it will not be copied unless you select backup and copy of this volume. So if you do this, all of the data that's actually on your data store, let's say you're running like a MySQL database within your Kubernetes deployment, right? You can actually copy the whole database file and we'll offload it for you to a backup storage location. So when you select a backup storage location, with Velero, you're supposed to bring your own S3 backup, right? Or your own S3 bucket to be able to back up to. Cloudcasa supports this. You can supply your own bucket, and we also have a bucket in every region of AWS and Azure. And that's all for free. You can just select it in your configuration and set your default backups. And yeah, so you select all your backups here, and you can also select policies, so you can manage schedules the same way as you would in Velero, right? So I can create this backup and say that I want to run it for a specific cluster on a specific day, every day of the month, something like that. And guided recovery. So the worst case scenario, your cluster gets destroyed. You have to rebuild it from scratch. Let's say you don't even have a cluster laying around, right? But you do have an AWS account registered with Cloudcasa. So that's simple. You just have to go on AWS, you install our CloudFormation stack, and that'll actually just create an agent that runs inventory on your AWS account. So it just checks what EKS clusters exist. And we also check for other things too, like RDS databases. We can back those up too. The main attraction here is that we just need to select one of our recovery points from our backup that we want to save, right? So we select the most recent one. Again, you have your resource and label options at the restore level too. So if you change your mind, you backed up everything, but you only want to restore deployments or something, you have the option to do that in the next step. And then if you're using a cloud provider and you want to restore to a brand new cluster, we'll actually look at the configuration that you had in your previous cluster when you backed up your data. And it'll give you a recommendation of what you should create in the cloud provider. So this is big for migration, especially between cloud providers, right? Because there's so much opportunity for mismatching of versions and distributions when you're going from AWS to Azure to GCP, or from bare metal to any of those. So being able to look at like the same node sizes, even though they all have different naming schemes and different resource versions, this way it'll give you a recommendation for an easy out-of-the-box cluster that'll be set up. So you can do that and restore to a brand new cluster, or you can select a different cluster that you've already registered in Cloudcasa. So you can build it up on your own if you want, and then just throw the resources on top of it. So this is all guided. It takes you through step by step. Every option is laid out and explained. Yeah, with Velero, if you got to this scenario and you need to recover, it's a nightmare sometimes, because if you needed to do something specific like this, like only restore a deployment with Velero, and you don't know what you're doing, it could take a couple hours just to understand, just to read enough documentation to understand the process, right? With Cloudcasa, if you can log on here and you can understand the concept of restoring to the same cluster or a new cluster, we can guide you through it pretty easily. And of course, there's always live support as well. So that is all the slides I have. I do want to do a quick demo to show you guys how you can import a cluster that has existing Velero install into Cloudcasa and how you can manage your backups. So let me just pull this up. So right now, I have my context set to a basic Kubernetes cluster on Minikube. All I have installed is Velero, right? So you just see there's a problem in my cluster, and I want to restore a backup because right now I have a pod that's crashing. So I have a few Velero backups. So just like kubectl, we do Velero backup get. It'll show me a list of all the backups I have here. And then we can do Velero schedule get, and you can again see all the schedules I have for running these backups. So what do I do now? I want to restore, but maybe I don't have access to this cluster anymore, or maybe I just want to be able to manage it with the UI. So we can go into Cloudcasa. So to add a cluster, all we have to do, go to configuration here, click on clusters, add a new cluster. So for an existing Velero instance, this is the easiest possible scenario, right? We're just going to hit yes. We give it a name. So I'll call this Velero demo. And register. So this will give you kubectl commands, copy and paste. And if you apply this on your cluster, all it's going to do is install the Cloudcasa agent and a couple of custom resources. Not that many though. Velero handles most of the custom resources. So if you already have it installed, that's great. All you really need is the deployment and the associated resources. So we'll watch that. It all gets installed into this namespace, Cloudcasa IO. And we're just going to wait for the Cube agent to go active. And it already is, it's running, so that's great. We go back to Cloudcasa, and installation is successful. As soon as the cluster is able to connect to the Cloudcasa server, you'll get a successful, it'll run an inventory, so it'll look at all your resources immediately and just make sure everything looks valid, but it doesn't perform a backup until we tell it to. But now we'll see this cluster has this little icon next to it to signify that this was imported with Velero already installed. And if we go to our backups, we'll see all the backups that I created in Velero before I added the cluster. So they're already ready to go in the UI. It shows me the last 3 runs, the status, and it shows me the recovery points that were created. So now with any of these recovery points we created with Velero CLI, we can actually restore through the Cloudcasa UI. So we just click restore on a recovery point. And again, this is all of our selections that we can make. I'll just leave everything at the default. And here is where we could actually choose whether or not we want to create or use an existing cluster. So if you add your AWS account, for example, you could actually hit create new, and it would give you a whole list of configuration options for your auto scaling groups, your EC2 nodes, what control plane you want to use and everything. For this demo, we'll just use the same existing cluster. A few more options. You can preserve your ports, you can overwrite things, or you can rename everything, put it in a new namespace so it runs along with whatever you have currently running. So we'll just do a basic restore here, give it a name. And that's it. Go to our restores, and we'll see it's in progress down here. So here's our live job monitoring. It's just basic logs, but it is nice just to get the feedback and see that your job is actually running once you hit go. So then it's just going to go through all the resources in the cluster. It's not going to copy the data on our persistent volumes because I didn't select that option, but it is going to actually copy the persistent volume and snapshot any changes that are made to it. And there it goes. The restore is done. So if I go back to my cluster, we won't really see any differences because I didn't do anything since we ran the backup. But just to prove to you, everything is good. We have all the same resources here. Cloudcasa Manager is running and Velero is still running. And then let's say you're done with this and you change your mind. You want to just go back to Velero. It's pretty easy to uninstall. We just remove these recovery points and then go to our cluster. And you'd be able to delete it. Configuration here. So our cluster configuration. Remove the cluster. So since this is a Velero managed cluster, this won't actually delete the recovery points that are saved in our backup storage location because Cloudcasa doesn't touch the backup storage location in this case. It's all going straight from Velero. If this were just the Cloudcasa cluster, if you didn't have Velero ahead of time, you could actually delete your recovery points through here. So with Cloudcasa, you can use your own backup storage location. You can add an S3 bucket in the UI. So that way, it's completely in your hands, right? It's coming from your cluster's Velero instance or from the Cloudcasa Manager running in your cluster, and it goes to your S3 bucket. So we're just kind of the UI serving in between, the service in between. And yeah, that's the demo I had today. So if there's any questions now, do that.
Any question? So the first question is that, is it only, it can be only integrated with any of the cloud service providers, or if I have my own, like kind of like an on-prem server on which I'll host it Kubernetes, can it be integrated with that?
Yeah, any Kubernetes will work. So if you have your own on-premises, as long as it's not 100% air-gapped, right? So it needs to be able to communicate with our server, but that's the only caveat. Otherwise, it doesn't matter if it's a cloud distribution or your own server. So for this example, I was using just a Minikube cluster that's running on my own laptop here. So it's not running off of AWS or anything.
So in that case, what are the for most of the backup options you mentioned, like S3 buckets, right? So that is again like very cloud specific.
So yeah.
So if I have my own server, then how do I back it? Like if I want to just back it up on a hard disk or like any storage location, right? Not the cloud.
So you'll need some storage that uses S3 protocol, right? So this isn't limited to only cloud providers. There is a MinIO, for example, is a Kubernetes deployment that actually creates an S3 bucket kind of locally. Like I think it's a fake S3, or it makes hard disk storage basically on your hard drive. So it works well with Minikube in that case, if you want to just run something for development completely on your laptop. But yeah, any storage you have, you can get an administrator to configure it to be S3 protocol. Then you could do it completely on premises, as long as you're able to connect to it. So yeah, your backup storage location can be totally isolated from our server.
The third point to confirm is for like Velero, you mentioned that we have to individually go on each of the cluster and then install, and then it will take the backup.
Right. So with Velero, if you're just using Velero, there are ways, like you can set up a template with something like Terraform that has Velero pre-installed for your clusters. Then you can skip that step. But in terms of actually creating and running your backups of Velero, you do have to log in and type the command out at some point, or have some kind of automation to do it for you. So there are ways to go about automating it, but it can be a pain. It can be a lot of steps, especially as you scale up.
And like, what are the security considerations, given that like I am allowing one external tool to access my clusters, which could be like maybe processing of private data like that is not, I don't want to expose it.
Right. So we can't even read your data once it goes to our S3 bucket. So everything is encrypted at rest at the end. And especially if you're using your own buckets, the data never even comes to us. We do look at how much data is moving through. But again, if it's going to your own bucket, it doesn't come to us. It doesn't. Yeah, but in terms of security from a cloud perspective, we are certified through AWS with well-architected review. And yeah, everything is encrypted. So you can bring your own buckets if you don't want to use the default ones that we offer you. That's a good solution for security.
Any questions?
So like I've seen there's only 3 providers, right? So again, let's go back to on-premises. There was an option to restore on your existing cluster.
Yeah.
And not existing, to create new cluster for restoring to. So what if I can I create new cluster in my on premises and then provide it as a source for the new restore?
Yes. So Cloudcasa won't actually create the cluster for you, but if you build up the cluster and then just install the agent, then you can use that as your source cluster.
Okay.
So yeah,
When you show me.
yeah.
Okay. Second one about data integrity. I saw there you can back up the whole. You can do snapshot and back up the whole persistent. So, for example, you said you can back up MySQL, but technically for data integrity, you need to stop it and then stop it. How
Good point.
How it's can look there.
So I didn't touch on this, but you may have saw there's something called app hooks when we run restore and backups. So we actually have a few default ones here, but these are basically just little scripts that you can set to run before and after you run a backup. So I think even one of the default ones that we have available is a MySQL one. So it actually, as part of the Cloudcasa agent, before you run the backup, will send out a command to whatever pod or namespace you decide or service. So you can set up a hook to actually stop all your databases before you run the backup or before you run the restore. And then you can set up a post hook to start it back up after. Okay, makes sense.
I'm just adding to your point, if I may.
Yeah, of course.
Like data and governance risk compliance, these are actually the part of the shared responsibilities up to the customer. They have to fix it, like what kind of data they are going in. But the encryptions, I think it should be depending on the tools, like what kind of encryption they're doing it, whether data in transit, store, or in use. So it's up to the customer. Any questions?
So you said you take snapshots to a backup. So what basically contains in that snapshot? I mean, what you are capturing?
Yeah, good question. So a resource snapshot in your cluster, it's like imagine you did like, if you're familiar with kubectl, if you did like kubectl get all in YAML format, right? It's basically the whole manifest of your cluster is snapshotted. So it's like a point in time snapshot of every resource that's running, every pod and deployment that exists, and other data too, like all of your secrets, all of your config maps, and CD data is all backed up too. So it's just a point in time snapshot of all the resources that are existing on your cluster, but not the data that's on the persistent volume itself. But we do support that as well. It's just another option that's enabled is copying the data from the persistent volume. So snapshot is like big picture what's going on in the cluster, whereas the copy job would be the actual data in the volumes.
So due to time constraints, like can take maybe 1-2 questions.
Okay, yeah, one more question.
Any?
Yeah, if we talk about in terms of, additional cost, adding, Cloudcasa to our clusters, like how much data is being transferred because it is over the internet, right?
Right.
If we have Velero, like we are only doing the internal communication, but over with this tool, we are just having, internal, internet communication as well. So how much, in terms of cost is added?
So I'm not sure about cost numbers exactly, but in terms of data, like you said, if you're using Velero and you have a local backup storage location already, that path will be the same. So the data will still go straight from your cluster to your backup storage location. So the only data that's getting sent back and forth is like a gRPC request from our agent. It's basically just checking in and making sure we can still reach your agent. And then if we need to start a job, we send out like a message to trigger a job. But other than that, no data. If you have a local S3 bucket to use, local backup storage, no data is really getting passed. Not no data, but your backup data is not.
But the logs and everything are getting fetched from that.
Yeah, so logs do get patched, yeah. That is a consideration. Yeah, it's not huge. I'm not sure about the numbers, but I could find out for you if you want to give me your email or something.
Thank you, John, for. So our next presentation is about a little different from this. It's kind of WAF, Kubernetes WAF, and it will be very interesting, like how Kubernetes come to the market and cloud security. How it is very important. I think Virgilio will provide more information about it.
We are hoping that we don't get a BSOD again, so. Yeah. All right, good evening. Sorry about that. Anybody after this show or after this event, anybody wants to buy a laptop? I'm selling me a good used laptop. Anyway, so my name is Santos. I work for Radware. I am going to go a little bit, not just specifically talking about Kubernetes WAF specifically, but I want to just talk in general about security, right? The challenge that we have with Kubernetes in its security posture. So for the one gentleman who basically says they're new to Kubernetes, this will be good for you. Others, there might be a little bit of some knowledge that you're already aware of. So let's go into it. So does anybody recognize this type of architecture? Okay, see, I'm pretty old, so this is how we used to deploy applications in the past. What was great about this 3-layer model, right? Anybody knows what I think was great? Visibility. Visibility and control was very simple, and security was very simple, right? So basically, I used to work for the government of Ontario, right? And if I was putting an application for Ministry of Transportation, we needed one firewall at the front of that. We captured the logs and we sent it off. Ministry of Justice, we had to have 3 layers of firewall. Every layer needed to be protected so that we could ensure that if there was an infiltration, it didn't move down the stack, right? So this was the way we used to do it. So great benefits, it was simpler, easier to troubleshoot, right? So when we're looking from the network perspective, I could easily see my logs, I could see the flows very simply, right? What was hard about it? When we used to have to deploy, so for example, MTO has an application that basically whenever there's a snowstorm, everybody in Ontario goes and tries to access where the road conditions are bad. That application was so hard to scale. We used to always crash because it had so many connections, right? And so if we wanted to port that, move that over to AWS or Azure, it was very hard, right? So that was some of the challenges. So here comes, microservices. Great. I can now split my application into containers, right? Different services for each part of my application and connect it all together. And wow, I put a file out there, a YAML file. I run orchestration through it, and I can scale it up, scale it down. Great. What's the problem, right? So I got the scalability, self-healing, right? Which when I'm working in my lab sometimes is a pain because it keeps my pod up. Basically, we have this great new capabilities with our microservices. So what's the problem? The problem really is visibility, right? So it starts with the challenge of visibility. When I have containers talking to containers, and that's contained within that environment, what am I able to actually capture, right, and to see? If I don't have visibility, how can I secure something I can't see? That's the other challenge that we have, right? The other thing it introduces is there's a lot more layers of complexity, and there's also more layers of security challenges, right? I didn't have to worry about authentication tokens necessarily in a three-tier application because it was all in a single monolithic code. Now I have to worry about authentication tokens, right? I have to worry about the images because a lot of times I might be pulling images from a centralized repository. Was that a good image or not a good image, right? So there's a lot of challenges that we have to overcome, right? And the problem really is we can't do this manually, right? So, unfortunately, you can't see that. Anybody here read the Global Mail this weekend? Global Mail had a great article on basically about the massive attacks that we are actually having in Canada, right? So Canada is number 2 in the world as a country that is being under attack, right? This is a report done by IBM that actually indicated that. Indigo, everybody hear about the Indigo attacks, right? Basically took them down, right? They basically did not pay the ransom attack, but they spent $5.2 million on getting overtime, getting specialists, buying software to try to fight that, right? So all these are actually quotes from that article. So, and I have a link at the bottom. I don't know, are we sharing the slides after with the Kubernetes user group so they can actually see it? Yeah. So basically, we could basically share this, but it was a great article. And the one thing that I found really interesting was the fact that hackers out there, it's like a regular job for them. They got a manager, they got an org chart, right? They get vacation. So basically it is, this is a really sophisticated thing. It's a lot easier to attack something than to build something that's very well protected. So complexity. So this is from a presentation that Amazon put out. That's what their container environment looks like. How do I basically troubleshoot that, right? How do I see what's going on there, right? This is from a Netflix. Okay. That's what happened. You moved it off the presentation. So this is from a Netflix. I was watching a Netflix presentation last week. This was out of their presentation. This is what their environment looks like, right? So just imagine I have basically a call going from this service to that service. How do I see it, right? So this is a big challenge that we have, right? And yes, these are extreme examples, but we still have the same challenge regardless if we're running 20, 30, 50 pods, 100 pods, 1,000 pods, right? So the first thing we got to do is figure out a way of getting visibility, right? If you read the Kubernetes website, it'll actually tell you that there is challenges in viewing their logs, right? It is not an easy thing to do. And if you are going to read it, you're going to have to be somebody who's very familiar. The NOC and SOC team are not very familiar with Kubernetes environments. They're used to that first layer, right? So what do we have to first do? First thing is probably put something like a service mesh in. Why was this a good thing? Because now with the service mesh, the control plane and the data plane, I basically can now take those calls, those API calls that are going between services And now I put them through a proxy. What does that do for me? That adds my visibility, right? If it adds my visibility, I also can do distributed tracing. This is huge because if I have 1,000 calls, how do I know which calls are correlated to each other? So I can troubleshoot and from a security perspective, know how that the malware got spread. So distributed tracing is critical. I could do traffic management. And most importantly, you can now start adding security to your environment. So once we add, basically a service mesh in there with some proxies, I can get something like Kiali to basically start getting my visibility. What do I get now? I see very easily and clearly my connections. I can see where my connections are breaking, right? I start to see the error codes. I start to collect this visibility, right? So I start getting this information. And just to give you an example of some kind of attacks that we saw. So I don't know if anybody read this blog about CrowdStrike fighting a Velero crypto mining attack. Anybody read that? No? So basically, what this Velero crypto mining did is basically went out there, looked for APIs, Kubernetes environments that were basically vulnerable to certain types of API calls, specifically authentication anonymous, right? And when it found it, it basically would set a daemon set through a daemon set. It would basically deploy a pod for basically a crypto miner that would be running in their environment. It actually wasn't too malicious, other than the fact that it was now taking up your resources in your environment. So if you're paying for those resources, it was bad. So CrowdStrike actually went through, and as you just noticed, right? I work for Radware, but I'm talking about the industry, and so I'm not talking about any specific, one solution here. So one thing that we saw is that, that basically they were pulling from Docker Hub, they were pulling an image called Pause, I think it was called, and that image was basically the malicious crypto miner. In 1 month's time that it was there. Pushing clicking the wrong button. In the 1 month that was there, it was downloaded, I should say, 4,000 times, right? That shows you that code was probably running in 4,000, different pods around the world. So it was pretty massive. And then what's really interesting, and if you actually go to this link, you can see that. So after another, hacker went out and basically started doing Monero cryptojacking. And they actually realized that there was this Velero crypto mining going around, and they would actually do something even worse. They would basically first delete the Velero crypto mining. They would replace with their own crypto mining servers, or I should say containers. And then what they would do really to hide themselves is they would actually start getting rid of the logs, right? And overwriting the logs and start running as root. So they actually were a lot more malicious. But so as you can see, an attack can be somewhat, non-threatening from a sense that they're not exfiltrating data, and then it could go to a part where it actually becomes quite dangerous for an environment. So when we start looking at our environment, we have to start thinking about security. So I actually was not aware of this until this week when I started putting this presentation together for this event. We've always known about some of the challenges with security in a Kubernetes environment, but I wasn't aware that OWASP actually last year in 2022 actually published a list of types of attacks that you need to protect yourself with. So everybody here know who OWASP is? Heard of it, right? Okay, so OWASP basically is a nonprofit organization put together with some industry experts, and they come together and they talk about what they're seeing out there and what some of the security challenges are and how do we protect it, right? And so there's a lot of things here that are actually, you think they're pretty common sense, but they're actually not really, thought about or checked, right? So sometimes when we deploy something and we're deploying it in a development environment, we might put some backdoors, we might put some access, we might create some APIs that are basically there for us to help troubleshoot or to help test. But once it's actually deployed, it might be left behind, right? And because code is, contains all these different containers, it's hard to actually keep track of these kind of things. So although we have these issues in a Kubernetes environment, this does not mean that we don't still have the standard application, mobile application threats. We still have to worry about it. So this is not this is an addition to what we already have to worry about, right? So there's a lot of challenges from a security perspective that we have to be aware of. So if we look at some of the threats that we really are concerned about, right? We're really concerned about the web and mobile threats. This is the application. This is when you go to your phone and you go to your banking and you're trying to, do a transfer of, $1,000 to your friend or something like that. How do we protect that, right? So we have the OWASP web mobile threats that we have to worry about, right? Things like, server-side request forgery, right? We have things about misconfiguration. API threats. This is very similar, but it's looking from an API angle, right? The difference is with the API threats, I very rarely get to see what an API is actually pulling, right? Unless I'm troubleshooting or I'm creating an app or something like that. API threats are really meant for machine-to-machine consuming, right? So there is a list that of basic potential threats in our APIs that we have to be aware of. And then, of course, we have the bot threats. That's another key thing. The bots are related to the mobile and to the API threats, but the difference really is that when it comes to bots, right, what we're seeing is that there is a certain pattern that's always occurring, right? So basically, we see that they're always using this type of browser, or they might change, right? Because they're faking the browser, they're faking the user. They might even try to fake, the mouse movement and things like that. So how are we able to detect things like that, right? So one of the things we can do, going back to the Kubernetes part of our protection, we have things like tools like Panoptica, right? I don't represent Panoptica. Panoptica is sold by Cisco. I'm just using this as an illustration. Checkpoint has their application as well. We have Palo Alto has Prisma, right? And there's a few other tools out there, but I'm just using, Panoptica. I've used it. I've done a few POCs where customers have used it. And so I'm bringing this to light. So what Panoptica does is it kind of hardens your Kubernetes environment, right? So what does it do? Basically, it does a check, right? It doesn't allow any containers to run without them being approved, right? It'll actually check and scan your images to make sure that that code isn't actually been, it isn't malicious, doesn't have any vulnerabilities, right? You will see if the workload is public facing. Why is that important? Because it's a higher risk if it's public facing, right? So this is the kind of stuff that we can start doing with some automated tools, right? The other thing we can do as well is map what this tool Panoptica does is also map the threats to the MITRE attack. So if somebody knows what the MITRE attack is, it's basically how threats actually expand, how usually they occur, right? And so there are different types of issues that can occur, right? For example, the initial access, right? So how does an attacker first get access to our environment? How do we protect that, right? So you have vulnerable workloads, right? So it kind of gives you a check. It looks at your code, it looks at the configuration, and it actually tells you, is your Kubernetes environment running, and is it vulnerable to these types of attacks, right? Another thing is things like the lateral movement, right? How is it able to move from east to west, right? Why is that important? Because if an attacker gets to one part of my environment and they have ability to move, right? It's very easy for that to spread and to become, my whole platform. So when we start looking at this, to summarize it a little bit closer, is the first thing we have to think about is the penetration. How do I get access to that application, right? So what's important about that is basically, what am I exposing? What APIs am I exposing, right? How is the access to that environment, right? So when an attacker does this, they do usually reconnaissance around the application. They'll launch a series of tests to see what your application is responding to. Once they find some kind of port that they seem to get access to, then they will actually they'll infiltrate your environment. At that point, the next stage of that attack is to basically move laterally. Why? Because it becomes harder to basically to remove and also becomes harder to detect. And then once they do that, they start actually executing whatever it is, right? So if it's a ransomware attack or attacker who wants to plan on doing ransomware, they're going to exfiltrate your data and then they're going to encrypt your data, right? Like we saw at a few hospitals that I've been involved with. If they just want to basically steal intellectual property, they're just going to exfiltrate that data and then they're going to hide their steps, right? They're going to hide, all the activity logs on those servers, right? So we need to be able to basically protect our environment from the beginning all the way to the back. Now, when we were talking about microservices, 86% of the communication is lateral, east-west, right? Most of that communication that's occurring is basically occurring through API calls. I know it's kind of hard to see on the screen, but if we actually look, this is taken from Kiali, if we actually look at all the communication, we see their posts, their get, there could be pushes, right? There, there could be delete, right? So there could be a whole series of API calls that are occurring. And this is really what we have to start, protecting from transactions that are occurring between all the different, worker nodes. So we have a solution, right? So basically we have something called a Kubernetes web application and API protection, right? So what's great about it is that this itself is containerized. So therefore, as your Kubernetes cluster grows, it actually will grow with it, meaning that it's going to take on some of those, benefits of a Kubernetes, right, environment, which is basically it's going to be able to scale, right? It's going to be able to self-heal, right? And it's very streamlined and very light, right? And that's one of the key, key differences in the environment. The other thing it's going to be able to do, it's going to be able to integrate with your other visibility tools. So you're going to get a complete view of your environment, not only from the transactional logs, but also from the security logs as well. So what does the the KWAP actually do, right? So basically, it's going to do your OS top coverage and protections for your application, right? This is the standard protections that we need for our traditional applications and for our microservices applications. It's going to do things like ensuring that the RFCs are followed and when it comes to the HTTP protocols. It's going to make sure that there's not a SQL injection into your database so they can basically break into your environment, right, and steal that data, right? It works in something called the negative and security positive security model. And what does that really mean? It means a negative security model, think of it as being a signature. I know this is bad, I'm going to have a signature to block it right off. And think of a positive security model as being us knowing what is appropriate action for your application. This is done through a learning state, right? So we can basically configure it, but it's also done through a learning state. The other thing it can do is the APIs. One of the things that we've seen in almost every customer I have talked to that I've done a proof of concept, right? Cisco calls it a proof of value, is basically ask the customer, can you give me a copy of your APIs? You know what they say to me? What? Right? A lot of customers don't have fully documented APIs in their environment. So one of the things that we need to do is figure out what are the APIs that are actually out there in a customer's environment or your environment. And the way you could do that is by collecting it from all the developers. That's one. The problem is that a lot of times an application today is built up also of third-party components. So you might not get all the APIs from those third-party components. So where do you get that from? So if you can actually parse the connections and if you can actually go through and discover those APIs, now you get a complete picture. And once you have a complete picture of your APIs, now you're able to protect them. And when I say protect an API, it's not block or allow, because you might have an API that needs to be allowed from the public internet, right? The question is, what is allowed? What commands are allowed? Is it a get or is it a post? Is it both? Am I allowed to send text value in that, or am I only allowed to get a numeric value? How long can that be, right? So these are all things that you need to be able to control because it's taking advantage of some of these, right? So if you guys heard of buffer overflows, that's a very common way, and it's been around for a lot of years, but it is still a common way of an attack. The other thing we also want to show is that with this as well is we can basically, scale, like I was mentioned earlier, we could scale horizontally, right, with your application. And I'll show that a little bit later in the next slide. So one of the things we should do, and not necessarily, from my perspective, but from your perspective, when we looked at those OWASPs for all the different categories in an application, right, and including in a Kubernetes environment, is figure out where these threats are and how our application is being protected today. Now, how many of you guys today work in a microservices environment? How many guys today actually involve your security team from day one on your application? Wow, okay. So that's about 30% of the people that actually do. And so one of the key requirements is really, we need to start involving the security teams. And trust me, that sounds painful, and sometimes it is, right? Because I used to have to deal with the security teams, but they're there for a reason. They ask the right questions, right? And one of the things we need to start doing is starting to think about all these threat vectors and what tools do we have in place to actually protect against these types of threats. So for example, this is a mapping of the OWASP API top 10 and what features, functionalities that we have and how we actually are able to address those kind of threats, right? So once we start to do this, and you go through, and it's possible that you might have to go through an audit, right? I've just gone through an audit with Deloitte. It was very painful, but they ask all these detailed questions. How are you protecting? What kind? I got questions like, show me how you manipulate the cache headers and things like. So they ask a lot of detailed questions. So the first step I think we need to do in our applications, in our environment, is to basically try to figure out how we're protecting against all these potential threats, right? So bots. So bots are great and they're bad, right? So the way I today find out, where the best pair of running shoes are and the best prices, I go to Google and I search for it, right? That's a bot, right? In the old days, we used to call them web crawlers, right? But so there's the good bots and there's bad bots. The problem is that we have to also be able to make sure that the bad bots are not affecting our website or our applications or our APIs, right? Because bots are actually trying to reach out to everything. What's the problem with these bots, right? So if you think about hearing about a concert that basically got sold out in 5 minutes, trust me, that was bots that were being used by ticket scalpers to basically collect those tickets, right? So it makes it unfair. So that's not very security related, but it's like something that's unfair. Security related could be, if they get a list of usernames and potential passwords and they start doing, password cracking, right? Credential cracking, right? That's another challenge that could be as well, right? Other things that we also have to worry about are things like being able to basically infiltrate databases and steal data from that, right? These are all things that bad bots are out there doing. So, and we need to protect against that kind of stuff. So the question is, how do we deploy a Kubernetes WAF, right? The Kubernetes, API and protection is basically, there's two basic methods of doing it. Number one, and we usually see this in a POC environment, right? Which is we basically put our KWAF pod, put our KWAF basically as inline. So any traffic coming from north, south basically is going to go through us. So this is great for proof of concept because it's very simple, right? Doesn't require a lot of changes. Basically, I can have that, right? So it basically acts as a reverse proxy. What we actually prefer and what we see in production is actually to put it out of band, right? So it's still a pod running in your Kubernetes environment. The proxy, in this case, I have Envoy, but it could be something else, right? Takes that connection, and one of the things a proxy is supposed to do and can do is basically look at the request and then, based on the configuration or the security criteria, forward over to a KWAF to basically be inspected. If it is allowed and it's seen not to be malicious, it sends back a 200 OK, allowing that connection to go through. If it sees that it's malicious, it sends back a, sorry, there's you're trying to do something that's malicious page to the user. This is done both for, like I said, end user connections and for API connections, right? So we're doing it for both. And this could be done for every connection between your containers, right? Between all your workers, right? So that, as you can see, these are some of the ways we can deploy it. These are some of the proxies and that we use, H8 proxy or Nginx, right? F5 as well. So now, when we actually detect something, so we provide visibility into that environment, this visibility will show you and map things back to the OWASP top threats. It will show you how many transactions, how many errors that we're seeing. And then in the event that we're actually, somebody gets blocked or something like that, we actually provide the detailed logs, right? You can actually download the actual logs, the whole event, and basically be able to inspect that. If, in case this was a false positive or you realize that you should be allowing it through, you can basically just click on, allow, and now that traffic is allowed through your environment. So, just to summarize, basically, this is just an overview on some of the challenges that we have in Kubernetes, right? Some of the visibility. So it starts with visibility that we really need to be concerned with. I think the biggest lesson that I want to talk about is the fact that it's really about security in depth. There's not one vendor. I work for Radware, like I said earlier. There's not one vendor that's going to give you a complete protection from your environment. It's all about layered protection, and you need to make sure that you cover each part of that environment, right? Traditional, WAF protections for north-south, are still required for those environments, and east-west is really important as well, right? So, and like I said, APIs are probably your most vulnerable, concern in a Kubernetes environment. So, any questions? That's it for me. Oh, did you want to say something?
So I think so. Virg has already covered that. My name is G. I basically head the alliances for Canada. And while Virg has completed the geeky stuff or the Kubernetes piece of it, I would just tell you that just introducing the company to you, because we do great on the product side of things, but we don't do great on the marketing side of things. Actually. So just giving you a very, very brief snippet of what we do. So Radware is an Israeli company, headquartered in Tel Aviv, operational headquartered in the US. I have known this company back in India as well. I used to be an ethical hacker. Don't do that anymore now, but that's quite interesting stuff. So we basically deal in 3 branches, starting with making applications available. So we are known in the market for our bread and butter solution, which is the DDoS mitigation. So a lot of big guns in the market use our technology. So Cisco's DDoS mitigation is basically Radware. Checkpoint's DDoS mitigation is basically Radware. Akamai's DDoS mitigation is basically Radware. It's based on Radware technology. So they white label us. We also have, as Virg covered, he covered WAP. So Gartner has come up with this new word or this new jargon called WAP. So they feel that they are right in their sense. WAF itself is not enough. WAF has to be complemented with a great API solution, as Virg was trying to cover that, along with a bot solution. So WAF plus API becomes WAP, or Web Application plus API put together. So we have that piece. Not many in the market presently has a KWAF environment. We not only have that, it's a very stable solution. And this solution was created because one of our large clients, I cannot name the client, but it is one of the largest SaaS vendors across the globe. I can tell you that, based in the US. So it is a battle-tested solution. The last hit this solution was able to take was a 600 gig attack. So it was a 600 gig attack can actually take down a service provider as well. It is huge. We normally say large attacks of the level of 50 and 60 gigs. We're talking about 600 gigs of protecting against attacks. This is the solution. So this piece, our WAF solution, is presently deployed and protects Ukraine as well from the very first day. So we started publishing that just a year ago because we did not want to tell the communities to come and attack us. So we were behind Ukraine from the day one in protecting them using these. The last piece is we have a cloud solution that we have, which is basically if you have different, I think so we were covering in the first presentation that if you have AWS, Azure, or Google, you can get a single pane of glass across all these environments. We call it cloud native protector. So we have all these solutions, and if you have any questions, more than happy to answer them for you. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Sid. Any
Any
questions?
Any questions about? Yeah. Yeah. So sorry, so I'll repeat your question. So who would hire a hacker? Yeah, it's definitely through it's definitely through the dark web. You know what? It's actually there's hackers everywhere around the world. Canada, US have been known. The UK is very big on hackers. A lot of hackers there. So it's all around the world. Yeah, we usually think hackers might be in some places like in third world countries, and that's not always true, right? If they're actually all around the world, and this is not from a KWAF or Kubernetes perspective. This is from an attacker perspective. So like Jeet said, we basically do DDoS protection for most of the top 100 enterprise companies around the world and service providers. And we're seeing that a lot of the attacks are actually coming from Canada, right, and from the US, right? And sometimes it's hard to tell because remember I talked about those, in Kubernetes environments where basically, somebody gets an authentication keys to get into a workload, right? Unprotected workloads. They can actually leverage and start those attacks from there. So what you have to look at is where the command and control servers are. And once again, those are all over the world, right? So we talked about why not we disconnect certain parts of the world because, like against Ukraine, we see attacks from Russia, but the attacks they're just coming from everywhere. We actually have a dashboard if you want. If you go to basically radware.com/dashboard, you'll actually see a dashboard and you'll see where the attacks are coming from. What is sorry?
Kubernetes is basically your orchestration platform where you run and
So one of the great things about the Kubernetes environment, like if you saw my first slide, right, I had to physically deploy a server, right, to basically put in the application. So I'd run one server, one physical server would be one application, and even if that application wasn't busy, then we got into virtualization, we could slice that. With Kubernetes, we could basically split that application into all these little portions, right? These what we call containers. And we could actually allow it to expand. And because it knows, about the state of each portion, it can actually spin up and spin down containers as it needs, right? So it's an excellent solution. It's really cool. I love it, other than supporting it.
Next question.
So you mentioned that you're going to try to protect the APIs.
Yeah.
That means that the company have to share the APIs with you?
Yeah, so that's we always recommend that if a company has their list of APIs, that they provide to us in Swagger Fire so we can upload it. But we find that most companies do not either, they don't have a complete one or they don't have one at all. So that's why we have API discovery, right? Now, it's not just us that has API discovery, others do. The difference with our API is the fact that what we do after we discover it. We have very tight controls on what you're allowed to do with that API, right?
Right, but let's say a company has developing a software solution, let's say the financial sector, the API could be their crown jewels, and why would they not share it with you?
Well, they're not sharing it with us. They're basically, this is a product that the customer would buy, and the customer is going to basically manage. This is not a managed solution. This is a customer basically buys it like a firewall. They take it, they install it in their environment, and then they run it, right? And so
what kind of data do you get from this product? What kind of?
We're not going to see any data. If it's an air gap solution and it's going to be in your environment, we don't get any data, right? It's going to see all the connections that go through and the payload that goes through, right? That's how it's able to protect, right?
So you're as a service.
It's not this Kubernetes KWAF or KWAF is not a software as a service. No, it's basically you purchase it, and then it's yours. And if you want to pay for support, you pay for support, and we can support it. If you don't want to pay for support, you don't have to.
Any more questions? I think we're very short of time.
I'm just curious
Yeah.
how you guys are being audited, like with other requirements, because I'm a financial auditor in terms of, I know that you mentioned something about OWASP, but that's pretty much the framework and best practices.
Mhm.
So when they audit you,
Mhm.
what is their regulatory requirements?
Yeah, yeah. So for example, like, one always comes to mind is GDPR for European, right? So you got basically SOX, you got HIPAA, it depends on what environment you're going to be on, right? For example, we also have, solutions that are in the federal government in the US. And so then there's things like FedRAMP, right, that you have to, right? There's NIST, right? There's all these different requirements. And depending on who the customer is in the organization, there's different types, right? So there's ISO 27001, right? So there's a whole bunch, right? So most of the requirements that we have for the audits, a lot have to do with our cloud services, like the cloud DDoS, cloud WAF, right? When it comes to on-prem, you don't have to usually go through like, is it HIPAA compliant and stuff like that, because what you're looking there is to achieve certain features and functionalities. Am I sharing public data, right? Or am I sharing patient data, right? So, and so what the WAF does, or the web application firewall is doing, is basically blocking those connections. So we are a checkbox for the customers to meet their compliancy requirements, right? So it's not our product that's meeting it, we're a checkbox for the customer to meet their requirements.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions?
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. You can guys can go and have it, and you can come back in 5 minutes. You can wrap it up. You can show the rest of the PPT, or we can take few questions, or we can let you know the next one, the September 25th, 6 to 7:30 p.m. we have. We might take your feedback later on, like if you want kind of education perspective, you can add on those in Kubernetes, like now 1.2.7 to 1.2.8 Kubernetes coming, what new things are coming. If you guys would like to know about it, you can add that in the agenda in the next coming months. So I think go ahead and have food first. Thank you.
I am.
John. Yeah.